At 8 years old, I was forced to perform oral sex on my sister. At 9 years old, I experienced sexual acts with boys and girls, or was coerced to engage in sexual acts with boys and girls. At 13, my mom left and I was sexually molested. At 14, I was introduced to cocaine and later attempted suicide. At 15, I was evicted and forced to live with a child molester. At 17, I reconnected with my mother and graduated high school. At 19, I started drinking and dated a married man. At 20, I started working in the healthcare industry. At 22, I became a foster parent. At 22, I was depressed, contemplated suicide, and spent the week in a mental institution. At 23, I sold crack. At 24, I became a stripper and was extremely depressed. At 28, I graduated from junior college, started sleeping with women, and was in a relationship with an abusive man. At 28, I became pregnant with my first child and aborted. At 29, I was arrested for destruction of property. At 30, I had my first and only son. At 30, I became pregnant again and aborted. At 31, I became pregnant and lost that child due to an ectopic pregnancy. At 33, I lost my ability to walk, was in a wheelchair, attempted suicide again, and spent more time in a mental institution. At 35, I became the first in my family to graduate with a bachelor's degree. At 36, I dated a physically abusive man. At 37, I began speaking about abuse. At 38, I wrote my first book and started helping women heal one-on-one. At 39, I met Mr. Turner. At 40, I married Mr. Turner. At 42, I wrote my second book, Overcoming Toxic Relationships. At 43, I wrote my third book and received my certification for life coach. At 44, I wrote my fourth and fifth book. At 45, I discovered I lived with intestinal worms for over 38 years, and 70% of my skin was extremely damaged. At 45, I received my certification for professional speaker. At 45, I withdrew from graduate school. At 46, I quit my punch clock and started my own business. At 46, I healed my body from hypothyroidism, early stage heart disease, high cholesterol, alopecia, high blood pressure, obesity, and obviously grew all of my hair back. At 46, I returned to graduate school for my master's degree in social work. At 46, I wrote my sixth book, Detox or Diet. At 46, I created a skin renewal cream that healed multiple skin disorders and shipped internationally. At 47, I became a part of the National Society of Leadership and Success, Sigma Alpha Pi. At 48, I left Chicago and moved to Phoenix. At 48, I won a $1,000 Healthy Living Scholarship. At 48, I became a member of the Phi Alpha Honor Society. At 49, I became a member of the Golden Key International Honor Society. At 49, I separated from Mr. Turner. At 49, I received a $14,000 business grant. At 50, I completed my seventh book, Building a Better Me. At 50, I